dear friends of ancient stories, welcome to all who find peace in the timeless tales of Greek mythology. Tonight, we drift together into the depths of the wine-dark sea, where Poseidon's realm stretches endlessly beneath the starlit waves, where mysteries older than memory sleep in the deepest trenches, and where the eternal rhythm of the tides marks time in a way that mortal clocks can never capture. Before we begin our journey into these ancient waters, if you enjoy these quiet voyages through myth and legend, feel free to subscribe to Greek Myths for sleep and leave a gentle like. It helps these stories reach others who seek the same peaceful rest you do tonight. In the beginning, when the world was young and the gods were dividing their domains, three brothers stood at the crossroads of destiny. Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon had just won their great war against the Titans, and now came the moment of division. The ivory lots tumbled in an ancient urn crafted by their grandmother Gaia herself, each lot inscribed with symbols older than language. Zeus drew first, his hand emerging with the lot of the sky, and his eyes lit with satisfaction. Hades drew second, pulling forth the lot of the underworld, his expression unreadable as always. And Poseidon, youngest of the three by mere moments of immortal time, drew last. The lot of the sea lay in his palm, coral carved and eternally damp, smelling of salt and possibility. Some say he felt a moment of disappointment, for the sky seemed grander with its endless expanse and blazing sun. But as his fingers closed around the coral lot, visions flooded his mind, depths unexplored, mysteries uncounted, a realm that touched every shore and held secrets that would make even Zeus envious. The sea was not merely water and salt. It was memory and motion, depth and mystery, the cradle of life itself, the blood of the earth flowing in eternal circulation. Poseidon's first descent into his new kingdom was a journey of discovery. The waters parted before him like curtains of liquid jade, recognizing their new master. Down, down he went, past schools of silver fish that moved like living clouds, their scales catching the last rays of sunlight and scattering them like dropped coins, past forests of kelp that swayed in underwater breezes, each frond reaching upward as if in worship, past creatures that had never known the touch of sunlight, whose bodies were transparent galleries of their own organs, whose eyes had evolved to see in the darkest places. The pressure that would crush mortal bodies embraced him like a welcoming cloak. The cold that would freeze human blood felt to him like a refreshing breeze. As he descended, he began to understand that his realm was not one kingdom, but thousands, each depth its own world, each current its own nation, each reef its own city-state. The sea was layers upon layers of life and story, and he was master of it all. On the ocean floor, where tectonic plates met and ground against each other in slow, inexorable dance, Poseidon decided to build his palace, but this would be no ordinary construction. With his own hands, aided by the gentle nereids who had already pledged their service, and the patient sea spirits who had waited eons for a true king, Poseidon began to shape his home. He did not build it so much as grow it, encouraging coral to climb in specific patterns, coaxing pearl-producing mollusks to line the walls, persuading bioluminescent creatures to take up residence in crystalline globes that would serve as eternal lamps. The palace rose like a living thing, branch by branch, chamber by chamber. The throne room was vast as a canyon, its ceiling lost in blue shadows that might have been height or might have been the weight of all the water above. Pillars of twisted coral supported arches of compressed sand that had turned to glass under the pressure. Mother of pearl lined the great halls, catching and reflecting the filtered sunlight that reached even these depths, creating rainbows that danced like aurora borealis of the deep. In the center of his palace, Poseidon placed his throne, carved from a single massive pearl that glowed with its own soft light, like a captured moon beneath the waves. The pearl had been a gift from the oldest oyster in the sea, a creature that had been growing its treasure since the world was young. Around the throne, the floor was inlaid with every type of shell imaginable, creating a mandala of sacred geometry that pulsed with subtle power. But a palace needs more than walls and throne. Poseidon filled his home with wonders, gardens where anemones bloomed in impossible colors, their tentacles swaying to music only they could hear. Libraries where the history of the sea was recorded in patterns of coral growth, each branch a century, each polyp a year. Treasuries where the gifts of the sea accumulated, not gold and jewels, though there were plenty of those from shipwrecks, but the true treasures. The first sand dollar, the shell that sang the song of creation, the pearl of wisdom that formed around a grain of truth. His stables were caverns carved from rock, filled not with hay, but with the finest seaweed, where his hippocampi rested between journeys. These creatures were marvels, front half horse, back half fish, monets that flowed like water, eyes that held the wisdom of the depths. They had come to him during his first week of rule, swimming out of trenches so deep that light was only a memory. They recognized him as their lord without word or gesture, simply by the way the water moved around him. The early days of his reign were days of learning and establishing order. Poseidon walked the ocean floor, his footsteps leaving no trace in the shifting sands, but somehow marking his passage in ways that all sea creatures could sense. He learned the language of the whales, those ancient singers whose songs could travel from one end of the earth to the other. Their language was complex, not words, but emotions and images carried on sound waves, stories that took entire seasons to tell, genealogies that stretched back to the first whale that ever drew breath. He discovered the hidden springs that fed fresh water into the salt sea, understanding that these were the ocean's organs of balance, keeping the salinity perfect for life. Some of these springs were merely geological features, but others were the tears of naiads who had lost their way and become part of the greater water. He blessed each spring, giving it a guardian and a name, ensuring that the balance would be maintained. In the places where the earth's fire met the ocean's cold embrace, Poseidon found perhaps the strangest life of all. Around volcanic vents, where water hotter than boiling somehow remained liquid under the pressure, entire ecosystems thrived without any connection to the sun. Tube worms longer than a man was tall swayed in the chemical-rich currents. Crabs white as snow scuttled over rocks that would burn mortal flesh. Bacteria formed mats that were the foundation of food chains, unlike anything on the surface. Here was proof that life was more creative, more persistent, more miraculous than even the gods had imagined. The gods spent entire moons simply exploring, learning every trench and ridge, every current and dead zone. He found places where the water was so still it had stratified into distinct layers, each with its own temperature and inhabitants. He discovered underwater rivers, flows of denser water that carved channels along the sea floor, complete with banks and waterfalls. He located the sources of the great currents that circled the globe, understanding that his realm was not static, but in constant, purposeful motion. In those quiet times of exploration, Poseidon would often rise to the surface at twilight, when the sky painted the waters in shades of rose and gold, purple and amber. He would float there, half in his element and half in his brother's domain, watching the first stars appear. Sometimes Zeus's eagles would fly overhead, and the brothers would acknowledge each other, the eagle dipping its wing, Poseidon raising a gentle wave. These were the peaceful days before complications, before conflicts over cities and heroes, when the world was still learning how to accommodate its new gods. The sailors who glimpsed him in those moments saw only a shadow beneath the water, perhaps the curve of a dolphin's back or the swell of a friendly wave. But the wise among them knew to mark the moment, to pour wine into the sea and whisper prayers. Earthshaker, they called him, though he had not yet earned that title through anger. Horsefather, though his creation of horses was still to come. Blue-maned one, for the way his hair flowed like the sea itself when he chose to take human form. His horses came to him gradually, wild and free and perfect. They were not horses of the land, but creatures born from sea foam and starlight, conceived in the moment when waves crashed against rocks with particular force under a full moon. Their manes flowed like water, never tangling, always moving even when they stood still. Their hooves barely touched the wave tops as they ran, and the spray they kicked up formed temporary rainbows that blessed any who saw them. The first of these horses was named Skypos, meaning the cup, for the way his hoofprints in the water held moonlight like silver wine. He came to Poseidon on a night when the sea was phosphorescent, every movement creating trails of blue-green fire. The horse rose from the waves and approached the god without fear, nuzzling his hand like a domesticated animal, though he had never known bridle or bit. From Skypos came all the hippocampi, through matings with sea creatures that produced offspring of infinite variety. Poseidon did not tame these horses so much as befriend them, learning their names in the old language that predated words. That was more thought than sound. Each had its own personality. Asterion, who loved to leap, his jumps carrying him so high he seemed to fly. Leucos the white, whose coat was foam itself, and who could disappear into any breaking wave. Chrysaor the golden, whose neighing could calm storms or summon them, depending on his mood. They would pull his chariot made of golden coral and abalone shell when he needed to travel swiftly. The vehicle itself, a work of art that Hephaestus had grudgingly admired. The wheels were giant nautilus shells that spun without friction. The body was woven from kelp stronger than bronze, and the whole thing was decorated with pearls that glowed with their own light. But just as often, the horses would simply run beside him for the joy of running, their whinnies mixing with the sound of the wind and waves in harmonies that made dolphins dance. The god discovered that his realm connected all lands, that every river eventually found its way to his domain. This connection was not merely physical, but spiritual. Through the water cycle, evaporation, clouds, rain, rivers, sea, he touched every part of the earth. He could feel the pulse of the world through the water's movement, the gentle lapping of lakes where lovers met in secret, the rush of mountain streams carrying snowmelt and memories of winter, the slow, deep currents that circled the globe like ancient thoughts, pondering questions that would never be answered. Through the water, he touched every shore, knew every beach from the black volcanic sands of islands that had not yet been named to the white shell beaches, where the fragments of a million creatures' homes made a surface soft as flour. He felt every rain that fell to eventually join his kingdom, each drop carrying stories of where it had been. This one had watered a garden where a poet composed verses to love. That one had been drunk by a deer who would become sacred to Artemis. Another had frozen and thawed 1,000 times in glaciers older than the gods. His awareness extended up every river to its source. He knew the mountain springs where naiads were born, bubbling up from underground aquifers with their first laughs. He felt the great rivers, those that would one day be called Nile, Amazon, Ganges, as they carved their way to him, each carrying the soil of continents, the minerals that would feed his sea creatures, the memories of all the lands they crossed. The estuaries where fresh met salt were places of particular magic, nurseries where life learned to adapt, to change, to survive in multiple worlds. It was in exploring these connections that Poseidon first encountered the woman who would become his queen. Amphitrite was one of the 50 daughters of Nereus, the old man of the sea who had ruled the waves before the Olympians came to power. Nereus had accepted the change of rule with grace, recognizing that his time of kingship had passed. But his daughters were powers in their own right, each one governing a different aspect of the sea's nature. Amphitrite's domain was the sea's beauty, not its surface prettiness, but its deep, eternal beauty. The way light refracted through water to create columns of radiance, the perfect spiral of a nautilus shell, the dance of jellyfish that looked like living lace, the moment when a wave broke just so, creating a tunnel of water that held its shape for heartbeats before collapsing into foam. She was beauty not as decoration, but as truth, the rightness of form that followed function, the elegance of efficiency that nature perfected over eons. Poseidon saw her first from a distance, dancing with her sisters where the Mediterranean waters turned from turquoise to sapphire. The Nereid's dance was no simple entertainment, but a ritual that helped maintain the sea's harmony. Each movement stirred currents that would travel thousands of miles. Each gesture influenced the migration patterns of fish. Each leap affected the temperature gradients that controlled weather. It was choreography on a cosmic scale, performed with joy rather than duty. Amphitrite danced at the center, her movements creating small whirlpools of delight, her laughter like the sound of waves, on shingle, musical, rhythmic, eternally varying, yet eternally the same. Her hair was every color the sea could be, green in the shallows, blue in the deeps, purple where the sun hit it just right, black in storm light, silver under the moon. Her skin had the nacre quality of pearl, seeming to glow from within, but it was her eyes that caught him. They held depths within depths, mysteries within mysteries, the wisdom of waters that had existed since the earth first cooled. He courted her with patience, for immortals have time for proper courtship, and he sensed that Amphitrite was not to be won by force or dazzle, but by understanding. He would leave gifts where she danced, not common treasures, but wonders that showed he paid attention to her nature. Shells that sang when held to the ear, each one containing a different movement from the symphony of the sea, pearls that caught and held moonlight, so she could dance even in the darkest depths. Smooth stones from the deepest trenches that had never known sunlight, their surfaces carved by pressure and time into patterns that told stories of the earth's formation. At first, she was shy, swimming away whenever he approached, but her retreats were graceful rather than fearful, playful rather than rejecting. She began to linger a little longer each time before departing, to smile a little more warmly, to dance a little closer to where he watched. Her sisters giggled and whispered, creating curtains of bubbles that hid their conferences. But Poseidon could see that they approved, that they were gently encouraging their sister toward the match. The chase, when it came, was a dance in itself. Amphitrite fled not from fear, but from the joy of being pursued, leading Poseidon on a journey through all the wonders of the sea. Through coral mazes where fish spelled out messages in their schooling, past underwater waterfalls where different densities of water created the illusion of air. Around islands that existed only at low tide, temporary lands that the sea reclaimed twice daily, she showed him parts of his own realm he had not yet discovered, teaching him even as she fled. The dolphin, who finally convinced her to return, was special among his kind, wise beyond the wisdom of animals, able to speak in the language of both gods and sea creatures. Delphinus, he was called, and his arguments were not of power or position, but of partnership. He spoke to Amphitrite of how the sea needed both strength and beauty, how Poseidon's might required her wisdom to achieve true rule, how together they could create harmony from the chaos of waters. His words were like pearls strung on currents of truth, and Amphitrite listened. Their wedding was celebrated by all the creatures of the sea in a festival that lasted a full turning of the moon. Whales came from the farthest oceans, their songs harmonizing in frequencies that made the water itself sing. Dolphins leaped in perfect arcs, creating living fountains that caught the sunlight and threw it back as rainbows. The nereids wove garlands of sea flowers, anemones that closed and opened like breathing, coral blossoms that existed for only one day a year, kelp fronds braided with strings of tiny shells that chimed in the current. Even the fish participated, schooling in patterns that spelled out blessings in the old tongue, their silver bodies catching the light like written words. Octopi changed colors in synchronized displays, creating living murals that told the story of the sea from its birth to this moment. Seals clapped their flippers in rhythm, creating a percussion that echoed from shore to shore. The very currents arranged themselves into spirals and curves, the ocean itself dancing at the union. Triton was born from their union, the first of their children, herald of the deeps. From his first breath, which he took underwater without distress, it was clear he was a child of both parents. He had his father's strength and his mother's grace, could swim before he could walk, could speak to fish before he could talk to gods. His favorite toy was a conch shell that Poseidon carved for him, and even as an infant, when he blew into it, the sound carried to every corner of the sea, announcing news in a language older than words. Together, Poseidon and Amphitrite ruled with a balance that made the sea prosper. She softened his sometimes tempestuous nature, teaching him that the sea could be not just powerful, but nurturing. When his anger at some slight would have raised storms to devastate a coast, she would touch his arm and remind him of the innocent who would suffer. When his pride would have demanded absolute submission from all who sailed his waters, she would laugh and show him how cooperation yielded better results than domination. Under their joint reign, the oceans bloomed with life in ways that exceeded even the Golden Age's abundance. New species of fish appeared, painted in colors that had no names: the blue of twilight's last moment, the green of spring's first leaf seen through water, the purple of deep thought made visible. Coral reefs grew like underwater cities, each one a small metropolis teeming with inhabitants living in complex harmony. The deepest trenches yielded their secrets, revealing creatures of impossible beauty, jellyfish that pulsed with their own light like living moons, fish with transparent bodies through which their thoughts seemed visible as patterns of bioluminescence, octopi that could change not just color, but texture, becoming living sculptures that shifted from rough to smooth to ridged in heartbeats. Poseidon's relationship with the land was complex and tender, a constant negotiation between his domain and those of his siblings. He gave the gift of horses to humanity, though the story of their creation held more nuance than mortals knew. It began with his competition with Athena, but before that famous contest, he had been experimenting with the form, trying to create a creature that embodied the sea's freedom and power in a shape that could live on land. His first attempts produced wonders that were not quite right. The hippopotamus, powerful but too bound to water. The sea cow, gentle but too slow. Creatures that have since passed into legend, forgotten by all but the oldest stories. But when he finally achieved the horse, he knew he had created something special. The mane that flowed like water, the gallop that echoed waves on shore, the wild spirit that could befriend but never be owned. All these marked the horse as a child of the sea god born onto land. When mortals first learned to build boats, Poseidon watched with interest and care. The first vessels were simple, logs bound together, reeds woven into baskets, sealed with pitch, hollowed trees that barely deserved the name boat. But in each one, he saw the seed of possibility. These fragile crafts represented mortal courage, the willingness to leave solid ground and trust themselves to his realm. He sent gentle currents to guide the first sailors, calm winds to encourage their experiments, fish that practically jumped into their primitive nets. As boat building evolved into shipbuilding, Poseidon's fascination grew. Each new design was a conversation between mortal ingenuity and the sea's demands. The addition of sails was particularly pleasing to him. Here mortals had learned to harness his brother's winds to move across his waters, a cooperation between elements that mirrored the cooperation between gods. He blessed the shipwrights who built with respect, who included small shrines in their vessels, who understood that every ship was a guest in his realm. The first time a ship crossed open ocean, out of sight of land for days, Poseidon himself swam beneath it. The mortals aboard could not see him, but they felt his presence in the way the waves seemed to push them forward, the way dolphins appeared to guide them when they grew uncertain of their direction, the way the stars reflected in the still water during calm nights, creating a second sky to navigate by. When they safely reached the far shore, they poured wine into the waves and sang prayers of gratitude, and Poseidon received their offerings with paternal pride. He never destroyed without reason, though mortals did not always understand his reasons. A ship might be sunk not from cruelty, but to prevent it from reaching a shore unprepared for its cargo. Disease, war, an idea whose time had not yet come. A storm might rise not from anger, but to mix waters grown stagnant, to bring nutrients from the deep, to remind mortals that the sea was not their servant, but their host. Even his earthquakes, which earned him the title Earthshaker, often served purposes beyond punishment, releasing pressure that would otherwise build to catastrophic levels, creating new springs, reshaping coastlines to better harbor life. The god had many children, both divine and mortal, and each one carried some aspect of the sea within them. Some inherited his strength, becoming great heroes who could hold their breath for impossible lengths and swim to the ocean floor without harm. Others inherited his creativity, becoming artists who could capture the sea's mood in paint or stone or song. His monstrous children, too, were not merely creatures of terror, but guardians of sacred spaces, keepers of boundaries between the known and unknown. Polyphemus, the Cyclops who would one day encounter Odysseus, spent his early years peacefully on his island. His single eye, large as a serving platter, could see through water as clearly as air, and he would spend hours watching the fish in the shallows, learning their patterns, understanding their lives. He tended his sheep with the same patience the tide shows in shaping stones, and his singing, though rough to human ears, harmonized perfectly with the sound of waves on his island's shores. It was only loneliness and the cruelty of trespassers that would later turn him from shepherd to monster. Charybdis, before her transformation into a living whirlpool, was a daughter who inherited her father's vast appetite for life. She could drink rivers in single gulps, her thirst representing the sea's endless capacity to receive. Her tragedy came not from evil nature, but from excess. She drank too deeply, took too much, forgot the balance that her father tried to teach. Her punishment, transformation into a force of nature that could only consume, was as much mercy as justice, giving her a purpose that channeled her nature rather than fighting it. The winged horse Pegasus, born from Medusa's blood, but carrying Poseidon's essence, represented the god's reach, extending even into the sky. Where Pegasus's hooves struck the earth, springs burst forth a hippocrene on Mount Helicon, where the muses would come to drink and find inspiration. This connection between sea and inspiration was no accident. Poseidon understood that creativity, like water, must flow to remain pure, must find its level, must sometimes crash against obstacles to reveal its power. In the great palace beneath the waves, Poseidon held court with a mixture of majesty and informality that reflected the sea's own nature. Sometimes glass smooth and formal, sometimes wild and free. The architecture of the throne room itself could shift with his moods. When dealing with serious matters, the coral pillars would straighten, the pearl walls would gleam with austere beauty, the water itself would clear to crystal transparency. But during celebrations, the same space would bloom with color. Bioluminescent creatures would dance through the water like living stars, and the very currents would swirl in patterns that encouraged joy. His courtiers were as varied as the sea's inhabitants. Ancient Nereus would arrive with his white beard flowing like sea foam, carrying the wisdom of ages before the Olympians. He never showed resentment at being displaced. Instead, he served as an advisor whose counsel was valued for its perspective. His 50 daughters, the Nereids, each had specific duties. Galatea tended the coastal waters where fishermen worked. Thetis watched over sailors far from home. Samathe guarded the sandy beaches where seals pupped. Proteus, the shape-shifting old man of the sea, served as Poseidon's shepherd, tending the seals as mortals tended sheep. His ability to change form was not mere trickery, but a reflection of the sea's protean nature. In a single day, he might be a wave, a seal, an old fisherman, a piece of driftwood, a sea bird, each form teaching him something new about the realm he served. Those who could hold him through all his changes could compel him to prophecy. But his prophecies were like the sea itself, true, but often difficult to interpret. Glaucus had once been mortal, a fisherman who ate a magical herb and was transformed into a sea god. He never forgot his mortal origins, serving as a bridge between the human world and the divine depths. His prophecies were particularly valued by sailors because he understood their fears, their limitations, their hopes. He would appear to fishermen as one of their own, sharing knowledge of where the fish were running, warning of coming storms, teaching the patience that the sea demanded. Triton, as he grew, became his father's herald, but his role was far more than simple messenger. His conch shell could do more than announce. It could calm storms, summon sea creatures, create harmonies that healed both body and spirit. He learned from his mother the art of music as magic, from his father the power of sound to shape reality. When he played, dolphins would dance, whales would sing along, and even the waves would adjust their rhythm to match his melodies. The palace itself was a living ecosystem. Cleaner fish maintained the pearl walls, their constant attention keeping surfaces gleaming. Gardens of kelp and sea grass provided food and shelter for countless creatures. In the kitchens, hot springs heated by underwater volcanoes allowed for cooking methods unknown on land. Foods steamed in mineral-rich waters, seasoned with salts from different depths, each carrying unique flavors. The wine cellars held amphorae from shipwrecks, their contents aged by the sea into something between wine and ambrosia. Poseidon's library deserved special mention. Here, knowledge was stored not in books, which would dissolve, but in patterns of coral growth, in the arrangements of shells, in the memories of ancient creatures. A scholar could spend centuries learning to read these living texts, understanding how the spiral of a shell contained mathematical truths, how the branching of coral recorded historical events, how the songs of whales preserved stories older than writing. The god's workshop was where he experimented with new forms of life, working with the same creative force that had shaped the cosmos. He would combine existing creatures to create new ones, or modify forms to fill empty ecological niches. Not all experiments succeeded. The archives of the deep-held fossils of creatures too strange to survive, too specialized to adapt, too beautiful for the harsh realities of existence. But from his successes came the diversity that made the ocean endlessly fascinating. His relationship with mortals who lived by the sea was particularly complex. Fishermen knew him as provider and threat, the god who filled their nets but could also empty them, who could send them home rich or not at all. They developed elaborate rituals to maintain his favor, the first fish of the season thrown back with prayers, libations poured before setting sail, small shrines maintained on promontories where the sea's mood could be observed and interpreted. Coastal communities built their entire cultures around understanding and appeasing the sea god. They knew which winds brought his blessings, which currents carried his warnings. They could read omens in the flight patterns of seabirds, in the color of the water at dawn, in the way waves broke on familiar shores. This knowledge, accumulated over generations, was more precious than gold, passed from parent to child in stories that encoded practical wisdom in mythological form. The mystery religions that grew up around Poseidon were less well known than those of Demeter or Dionysus, but no less profound. Initiates would undergo ritual drownings, held underwater just long enough to touch the boundary between life and death, then pulled back to experience rebirth. They learned to hear the sea's voices, to understand the languages of fish and current, to feel the pull of the tide in their own blood. The deepest mysteries involved descent to underwater caves where the initiates would spend days in meditation, emerging with knowledge that could not be spoken, only lived. Sailors developed their own relationship with the god, one based on professional respect rather than worship. They knew Poseidon as a colleague of sorts, a senior partner in the business of sea travel. Their prayers were practical, for wind when becalmed, for calm when storms threatened, for the appearance of landmarks when position was uncertain. They threw coins into the waves, not as bribes, but as professional fees, understanding that safe passage had value that should be acknowledged. The gods' oracles were found not in temples, but in natural features where the sea spoke most clearly. Caves where waves created musical sounds that could be interpreted by trained priests. Beaches where the pattern of shells cast up by storms spelled out messages. Springs where salt and fresh water mixed in proportions that changed with the questioner's need. These oracles spoke not in riddles like Delphi, but in the plain language of the sea, direct, sometimes harsh, always true. Poseidon's influence on weather extended far beyond the immediate seaside. The hurricanes that formed over warm waters were his spiral dances, redistributing heat from equator to pole. The monsoons that brought life-giving rain to vast agricultural areas were his gifts carried on his brother's winds. Even inland droughts could often be traced to his moods. When the sea withheld its moisture, when the currents that drove weather patterns shifted, when the delicate balance between ocean and atmosphere was disturbed, his sacred groves were not of trees, but of kelp, vast underwater forests where sunlight filtered through fronds, creating cathedral light. These forests were more than beautiful. They were nurseries for young fish, hunting grounds for predators, highways for migrating species. Sea otters played in the canopy, their favorite stones tucked under their arms. Fish schooled in living clouds that moved like thoughts through the divine mind. The constant motion of the kelp created a hypnotic dance that could induce prophetic trances in those who knew how to watch. In these forests, Poseidon would often rest, wrapped in kelp fronds like blankets, feeling the pulse of life all around him. The kelp itself was aware of him, growing stronger and more vibrant in his presence. Creatures that normally fled from each other would coexist peacefully when he was near. Predator and prey sharing the same grove in a temporary truce that recalled the peaceful kingdom that could be. The abyssal plains, those vast flat expanses of the deep ocean floor, were Poseidon's deserts, not empty, but full of specialized life. Here, in the crushing pressure and eternal darkness, creatures moved with deliberate slowness, conserving energy in an environment where food was scarce. The god would walk these plains in contemplation, his footsteps stirring up sediment that had lain undisturbed for millions of years, each particle a memory of some ancient organism that had died and drifted down to become part of the seafloor. In the abyssal depths lived creatures that defied mortal understanding. Fish with telescoping jaws that could swallow prey larger than themselves. Squid with photophore patterns more complex than any constellation. Jellyfish that were essentially immortal, able to revert to younger stages of their life cycle when threatened by age. These creatures were Poseidon's experiments in pushing the boundaries of life, seeing how far adaptation could go, what forms could exist in the harshest conditions. The deepest point in his realm, the trenches that scarred the ocean floor like wounds that would never heal, held special significance. These were not mere geographical features, but connections to the deeper mysteries of existence. In their darkness lurked creatures that might have been older than the gods themselves, things that had survived from previous iterations of reality. Poseidon did not fully command these depths. He was their guardian and observer, but even gods had limits, and the ultimate depths held secrets that were not his to know. The phenomenon of deep water emergence, when creatures from the depths appeared in shallow water, or even on beaches, was often a form of communication from these deep places. A giant squid washing ashore was not just a biological oddity, but a message written in flesh and tentacle. These appearances often preceded significant events, earthquakes, tsunamis, or sometimes more subtle changes in the ocean's patterns. Mortals who understood these signs could prepare, while those who dismissed them as mere curiosities often paid the price for their ignorance. Bioluminescence was one of Poseidon's greatest gifts to his realm. In the eternal darkness of the deep, life created its own light. The god had not invented this phenomenon, but had encouraged it, blessing creatures that developed the ability to glow, communication through light patterns, hunting with luminous lures, defense through blinding flashes. All these strategies emerged from the marriage of life and light in the darkness. Sometimes, on the darkest nights, Poseidon would call all the bioluminescent creatures to the surface, creating displays of living light that turned the sea into a liquid galaxy. The chemistry of the ocean was Poseidon's alchemy, the salinity that made life possible, the precise balance of minerals that allowed shells to form and dissolve, the pH that kept the system stable. All these required constant attention. The god maintained this balance not through conscious effort, but through his very presence, his divine essence serving as a buffer against changes that would otherwise make the seas uninhabitable. When mortals began to understand chemistry, they were amazed at the precision of the ocean's composition, not realizing they were observing the handiwork of a god who was himself part of the system he maintained. The songs of the sea were endless and ever-changing, a symphony that had been playing since water first collected on the young earth. There was the percussion of waves on shore, gentle lapping on calm days, thunderous crashes during storms, the rhythmic susurration of pebbles rolled by retreating waves. There was the string section of wind over water, creating sounds that ranged from whispers to howls. The brass of whales calling across ocean basins, the woodwinds of dolphins clicking and whistling, the chorus of seabirds adding their cries to the mix. Poseidon knew every voice in this orchestra, could conduct it with movements of his trident, could add his own voice when the harmony needed deepening. Sometimes mortals with the gift could hear these songs, and they would become poets or musicians, trying all their lives to capture what they had heard in that moment of connection. The wise ones knew they could never fully reproduce the sea's music, settling instead for echoes and approximations that nonetheless carried something of the divine original. The migrations that crisscrossed his realm were processionals of purpose, whales traveling from feeding grounds to breeding grounds, their paths as fixed as stars, but as flexible as water. Sea turtles returning to the beaches where they were born, guided by magnetic memories and the taste of home water carried on currents. Fish moving in schools so vast they could be seen from the realm of the gods. Their collective movement creating patterns that spelled out the health of the ocean in a language, a connection between places, a thread in the tapestry of ocean life. Poseidon protected these travelers, sending favorable currents to speed their journeys, warning predators away from the vulnerable young, ensuring that the ancient paths remained open despite mortal interference. When a migration failed, when a species could no longer complete its journey, the god felt it as a physical pain, a breaking of patterns that had existed since before memory. The coral spawning was one of the sea's most magical events, and Poseidon attended everyone. On certain nights, triggered by temperature and moon phase and mysteries known only to the coral, entire reefs would release their gametes simultaneously. The water would fill with life potential, clouds of future reef builders rising like underwater snow falling upward. Fish would feast, but enough would survive to settle and grow, continuing the reef's slow construction. During these spawnings, Poseidon would bless the union of egg and sperm, ensuring genetic diversity, encouraging new combinations that would create hardier corals. He understood that reefs were more than structures. They were cities, ecosystems, barriers that protected shores, nurseries that sustained fisheries. Each polyp was a tiny architect, but together they built structures that could be seen from his brother's domain in the sky. The symbioses of the sea particularly pleased him. The clownfish and anemone, each protecting the other in an alliance that benefited both. The cleaner fish that kept larger fish healthy in exchange for food and protection. The zooxanthellae that lived within coral, trading photosynthesis for shelter. These relationships showed that cooperation was as powerful a force as competition, that mutual benefit created strengths greater than either partner could achieve alone. Poseidon encouraged these partnerships, sometimes gently guiding compatible species together, sometimes creating conditions that made cooperation necessary for survival. He saw in these relationships a model for how all life could interact, not just the strong dominating the weak, but networks of mutual support that created resilient communities. The most successful parts of his realm were not ruled by single dominant species, but were diverse collaborations where every creature played a vital role. The twilight zones of the ocean, neither surface nor deep, neither light nor dark, were regions of transition that held special fascination for the god. Here, creatures migrated vertically each day, rising at night to feed in productive surface waters, descending at dawn to avoid predators. This daily movement, the greatest migration on Earth in terms of biomass, was like the ocean breathing, mixing nutrients and energy between layers. In these zones lived creatures of compromise, eyes large enough to catch dim light, but not so large as to be cumbersome, bodies streamlined for vertical travel, colors that provided camouflage in the blue twilight. The lanternfish, despite being unknown to most mortals, were among the most numerous vertebrates on the planet. Their nightly rises feeding the surface predators, their daily descents carrying energy to the depths, the submarine canyons that cut through continental shelves were highways for deep water creatures moving to shallow areas. These canyons, carved by ancient rivers when sea levels were lower, created upwellings that brought nutrients from the deep. Poseidon had watched their formation over geological ages, had seen rivers become submarine channels, had observed as they were colonized by creatures adapted to the unique conditions of steep walls and strong currents. In these canyons, he would sometimes meet with the gods of rivers that had once flowed there. These meetings were tinged with nostalgia, remembering when the now submerged lands had been dry, when different gods had ruled these spaces. But there was no bitterness in these encounters. The river gods understood that change was constant, that what was once land would be sea, and what was sea would someday be land again. They would share memories and plan for futures measured in geological time. The ice seas of the poles presented unique challenges and wonders. Here, Poseidon's realm was capped by his nephew's frozen water, creating an inverted landscape where what would be sky was solid ice. Life had adapted to these conditions in remarkable ways. Fish with antifreeze in their blood, seals that maintained breathing holes through months of darkness, algae that bloomed on the underside of ice, feeding the krill that fed the whales. The narwhals, those unicorns of the sea, were special favorites of Poseidon. Their single tusks, actually elongated teeth, were sensors of extraordinary sensitivity, able to detect changes in salinity, temperature, and pressure. Through their tusks, they could taste the sea in ways even Poseidon found instructive. Their societies were matriarchal and peaceful, their movements through the ice seas like ballet, performed in slow motion. The polar seas also held memories of ages when the world was warmer, when forests grew where now only ice existed. In the deepest parts of these oceans, Poseidon could find remnants of these times, fossilized wood that had become stone, bones of creatures that had lived when the poles were temperate. These relics reminded him of the world's mutability, of the long cycles that even gods could only witness, not control. The interplay between ice and sea created phenomena found nowhere else. Brinicles, fingers of super cold brine that descended from forming sea ice, creating frozen tunnels that killed whatever they touched, but also created unique habitats, once stable, polynyas, areas of open water surrounded by ice that served as oases for air-breathing animals. The groaning and singing of ice as it formed and broke, adding another voice to the ocean's chorus. Poseidon's relationship with his brother Hades was reflected in the deep sea vents, where the underworld's heat met the ocean's cold. These vents were portals of sorts, not between realms, but between states of being. The water that emerged from them had been cycling through the Earth's crust for centuries, carrying minerals from the planet's interior, messages from the molten heart that Hades knew so well. Around these vents, life existed without any connection to the sun, deriving energy from the chemicals that emerged from the earth. Bacteria that could metabolize sulfur, tube worms that had no digestive system, but relied on symbiotic bacteria, crabs and shrimp that had evolved to live in temperatures that would cook most proteins. These ecosystems were like alien worlds within Poseidon's realm, proof that life was more creative and persistent than even the gods had imagined. The vent communities also lived on a different timescale than surface life. A vent might be active for only decades before the geology shifted and the hot water found a different path. Entire communities would die when their vent went cold, but somehow new vents thousands of miles away would be colonized by the same species. How these creatures found new homes across the vast, cold abyssal plains was a mystery that even Poseidon had not fully solved. His experiments with creating new life were not random, but purposeful, filling niches that he perceived in the ocean's ecology. When he noticed that floating sargassum weed created a habitat without permanent residence, he blessed certain creatures to live their entire lives in this golden floating forest. When deep-sea corals grew in cold, dark waters, but lacked the diversity of their shallow water cousins, he encouraged adaptations that would create deep reef communities as complex as any tropical reef. Not all his creations were successful in mortal terms. The giant squids and their even larger cousins, the colossal squids, were experiments in pushing the limits of invertebrate size and intelligence. Their conflicts with sperm whales in the deep created battles that no mortal eye had witnessed, but whose evidence washed ashore as scars on whales and beaks in whale stomachs. These creatures were so alien, so perfectly adapted to the deep, that even Poseidon sometimes watched them with wonder. The god's memory was the ocean's memory, stretching back to the first rains that filled the basins. He remembered when life was only microscopic, when the first multicellular organisms ventured into being, when the first fish evolved from something that was not quite fish. He had watched the first tentative crawlings onto land, had felt the ocean's children leave for new realms, had welcomed them back when they returned, seals and whales and turtles carrying the memory of land in their lungs. This deep memory informed his decisions, gave him patience with mortal follies. He had seen species rise and fall, had watched continents drift and collide, had felt the ocean's chemistry change as life evolved new ways of being. What seemed like catastrophes to mortals were often just transitions to him, painful but necessary changes that would lead to new forms of beauty and complexity. The language of currents was one of Poseidon's most sophisticated communication systems. The great currents that circled the globe carried messages between all parts of his realm, changes in temperature that warned of climate shifts, alterations in salinity that spoke of ice forming or melting, chemical signatures that told stories of volcanic activity or river flooding. Reading these currents was like reading a constantly updating book about the state of the world. He taught some mortals to read simpler messages in the currents, fishermen who could follow warm water streams to find fish, navigators who could use current patterns to speed their journeys, swimmers who could feel the pull of riptides before they became dangerous. But the full language of currents was too complex for mortal minds, requiring an understanding of global patterns and geological time that only gods possessed. The tides were Poseidon's most regular communication with the mortal world, his twice daily reminder of the sea's presence and power. But tides were more than mere water movement. They were the pulse of life for countless creatures, organisms that fed only at certain tidal stages, predators that hunted the between times when prey was exposed, plants that had evolved to survive both submersion and exposure. The tidal zones were laboratories of adaptation, showing life's creativity in dealing with constant change. Spring tides and neap tides created rhythms within rhythms, monthly cycles overlaying the daily ones. The highest tides of the year, when sun and moon aligned perfectly, were times of special power, when Poseidon could most easily manifest in the mortal world. Conversely, the lowest tides exposed parts of his realm normally hidden, revealing secrets to those who knew where and when to look. His palaces, for he had more than one, were scattered throughout the world's oceans. The Mediterranean palace, his first and favorite, was a place of classical beauty, all columns and courtyards reflecting the civilization that had grown around that sea. The Atlantic palace was wilder, built into underwater cliffs, constantly reshaped by the powerful currents. The Pacific palace was vast as that ocean, with wings that extended into trenches and rose to underwater mountains. Each palace served different functions. The Mediterranean was for formal occasions, receiving gods and important mortal heroes. The Atlantic was his workshop, where he experimented with new forms of life and new ways of shaping water. The Pacific was his retreat, where he could lose himself in the vastness, where even a god could feel small and find peace in insignificance. Lesser palaces existed in every sea, often simple caves or grottos that served as local administrative centers. The decor of these palaces reflected their purposes. Formal halls were lit by captured sunlight, channeled through crystal tubes filled with clear water. Private chambers used the soft glow of bioluminescent creatures, creating atmospheres that could shift with the gods' moods. Gardens displayed the best of each region's sea life, while treasuries held not just gold and gems, but the true treasures of the sea: perfect shells, unusual corals, pearls of every possible color. His throne in each palace was carved from local materials, marble from undersea quarries in the Mediterranean, volcanic glass in the Atlantic, a single massive pearl in the Pacific. But regardless of material, each throne was connected to all the others and to the sea itself. Sitting on any of them, Poseidon could feel the entire ocean, know what was happening in any part of his realm, respond to prayers or threats instantly. The social structure of his court reflected the sea's own hierarchies. Ancient sea gods held positions of honor, their wisdom valued even if their power had waned. Younger deities, often his own children, served as regional administrators, each responsible for a particular sea or significant body of water. The nymphs formed the bulk of the court, each with specific duties, maintaining coral reefs, guiding migrations, teaching young sea creatures the rules of their existence. Mortal heroes who had earned Poseidon's favor were sometimes granted minor positions in his court after death. Former sailors served as guides for newly dead souls who had died at sea, helping them adjust to their aquatic afterlife. Great navigators were given the task of maintaining the star reflections that helped living sailors find their way. Fishermen who had always thrown back the first fish became teachers, showing others the importance of reciprocity with the sea. The entertainment in Poseidon's court was like nothing on Olympus or Earth. Concerts where whales sang bass lines while dolphins provided soprano melodies, the percussion coming from mantis shrimps, whose punches created cavitation bubbles that popped in rhythm. Dances performed in 3 dimensions, where the dancers could move up and down as easily as side to side, creating sculptures of movement that land dwellers could never replicate. Theater where octopi played all the parts, changing color and shape to become different characters. But the greatest entertainment was the sea itself. Poseidon and his court would often simply watch the natural world, the ballet of mating cuttlefish, the architectural achievements of tiny creatures building vast reefs, the epic journeys of animals crossing entire oceans. This was reality television on a divine scale. Dramas and comedies and tragedies playing out in endless variety. The meals in the palace were celebrations of the sea's bounty, but not in the way mortals might expect. Gods did not need to eat, so dining was about pleasure and artistry rather than sustenance. Courses might include the essence of a perfect wave, captured at the moment of breaking, and served in shells that dissolved on the tongue. The memory of rain falling on the ocean, each drop carrying stories of its journey through clouds. The first touch of sunlight on water after a storm crystallized into something between food and light. The preparation of these impossible dishes was an art mastered by Poseidon's chef priests, beings who understood that in the divine realm, sensation and meaning were more important than substance. They could cook with currents, season with salinity, present plates that told stories through taste. A meal might recreate the history of a particular coastline, each course representing a different geological age, the flavors evolving as continents drifted and climates changed. Amphitrite had her own wing of each palace, spaces that reflected her different nature. Where Poseidon's areas were about power and vastness, hers were about intricacy and relationship. Her gardens were masterworks of symbiosis, where every creature supported others in webs of interdependence, so complex that removing any single element would collapse the whole. Her libraries contained not texts, but memories, the recollections of every creature that had ever lived in the sea, accessible to those who knew how to ask. She held her own courts, addressing matters that required a gentler touch than her husband's. Disputes between species over territory were mediated in her halls. New mothers, whether whale or shrimp, could petition her for protection for their young. The complex negotiations between predator and prey, ensuring that neither would exterminate the other, were overseen by her wisdom. While Poseidon maintained the physical ocean, Amphitrite maintained its spirit. Their children each reflected different aspects of their parents' natures. Triton, the eldest and most well-known, combined his father's power with his mother's artistry. His music could summon storms or create calm, could make whales dance or lull sharks to sleep. He was often away from the palaces, traveling the oceans, checking on distant waters, serving as his father's mobile representative. Rhode, their daughter, was given dominion over her namesake island, becoming a bridge between land and sea. She could walk on either element with equal ease, understanding the needs of both coastal mortals and sea creatures. Her festivals brought together fishermen and dolphins, sailors and seals, creating temporary harmonies between the human and marine worlds. Benthesikheim ruled the deep waves, those massive movements of water that could cross entire oceans without breaking. She was her father's daughter in her power, but had her mother's subtlety, influencing events through gradual pressure rather than dramatic intervention. Sailors who knew of her would pour wine into the sea when they felt the deep swells that preceded her presence. But beyond these well-known children were hundreds of others, each with their own domains and duties. Some ruled single bays or stretches of reef. Others governed specific species or phenomena. The sun who commanded all bioluminescence, the daughter who knew the language of every crustacean, the child who could walk through underwater avalanches without disturbance. This vast family was Poseidon's greatest creation, ensuring that every part of his realm had divine attention. The education of young sea deities was a complex matter. They had to learn not just the physical laws of the ocean, but its spiritual currents. Classes were held in tidal pools that served as microcosms of the larger sea, where young gods could practice their powers without causing tsunamis. They studied under ancient beings who remembered when the world was young, learning history through the choral record and prophecy through whale song. The curriculum included practical matters: how to create a beneficial current, when to allow a storm, and when to prevent one, the proper balance between fresh and salt water. But it also included philosophy, the rights of creatures to exist without divine interference, the responsibility that came with power over life and death, the importance of maintaining mystery in a world that increasingly sought to explain everything. Some young deities showed aptitude for specific aspects of ocean management. These would apprentice with specialists, learning the intricate chemistry of coral reef maintenance, the complex physics of wave formation, the delicate biology of plankton blooms. Others showed more general talents and would be groomed for territorial management, eventually taking responsibility for entire seas or coastlines. The failures were as instructive as the successes. Young gods who created whirlpools they couldn't control, who introduced species that became invasive, who tried to stop hurricanes and only made them worse. All these mistakes became teaching moments. Poseidon himself would sometimes share his own early errors, like the time he tried to make all fish the same color and nearly destroyed the reef ecosystems that depended on visual recognition. The gradual changes in Poseidon's realm required constant adaptation. As mortals learned to sail farther and fish deeper, new protocols had to be established. The first time a mortal vessel descended to the abyssal depths in a protective shell, the deep-sea gods were alarmed. Was this an invasion? Poseidon had to mediate, establishing rules for how much mortals could observe without interfering, creating designated areas where the curious could explore while keeping the true mysteries hidden. The pollution that began to enter his realm with mortal industry was a new kind of challenge. Unlike natural changes that occurred over millions of years, these alterations happened in decades. Rivers began carrying chemicals the sea had never known. The very chemistry of the ocean began to shift as the air above it changed. Poseidon found himself having to work harder to maintain the balances that had once been automatic. His response was measured rather than wrathful. He strengthened certain organisms that could process pollutants. He adjusted currents to dilute concentrations of harmful substances. He inspired mortals to understand the damage they were causing, sending dreams to scientists and visions to artists. But he also prepared for darker possibilities, creating refuge areas in the deepest trenches where life could retreat and wait if the surface became uninhabitable. The discovery of underwater oil and minerals by mortals created new tensions. These resources had been laid down over eons, each deposit carefully positioned to serve purposes mortals couldn't understand. Some were food for specialized bacteria. Others were barriers, preventing the escape of deeper, dangerous substances. When mortals began extracting these materials, they were like children taking stones from a dam, not understanding that each removal weakened the whole structure. Poseidon's priests and priestesses worked to educate, to create marine sanctuaries, to develop technologies that would allow resource use without resource destruction. It was a delicate balance. Mortals needed to live and grow, but not at the cost of destroying the very systems that supported all life. The god found himself in the position of a parent watching children play with dangerous tools, able to guide and warn, but not to forbid entirely. The coral bleaching events that began to occur with increasing frequency were particularly painful to witness. These reefs were some of Poseidon's greatest collaborations with life itself, cities built over millennia, supporting more diversity than any other ocean environment. Watching them turn white and die in mere seasons was like watching great libraries burn. He did what he could, moving cooler currents to threatened reefs, encouraging heat-resistant strains, creating underwater shade through kelp canopies, but knew that larger changes were needed. Climate change affected his realm in ways both obvious and subtle. The melting of polar ice changed salinity levels and current patterns. Rising temperatures altered the distribution of species, sending tropical creatures into formerly temperate waters. The chemistry of the water itself shifted as it absorbed more carbon from the air. Poseidon found himself managing a system in rapid transition, trying to maintain enough stability for life to adapt while allowing necessary changes to occur. His relationship with marine scientists became more direct than his usual mortal interactions. Through dreams and intuitions, he guided researchers to important discoveries. The graduate student who suddenly thought to check an unexplored seamount and found a new species. The oceanographer who felt compelled to measure currents in a seemingly unimportant area and discovered a crucial circulation pattern. The marine biologist who dreamed of a specific chemical and woke to realize it could help coral survive warmer waters. But even as challenges mounted, new wonders emerged. Life's creativity in adapting to changed conditions amazed even a god who had watched evolution for eons. Fish that learned to process microplastics, corals that formed partnerships with new types of algae, whales that adjusted their migration routes to take advantage of new current patterns. The same force that had created life in boiling, chemical-rich waters billions of years ago was still at work, finding ways to persist and thrive. The deep-sea mining operations that mortals began to contemplate required divine intervention. The abyssal plains they saw as empty deserts suitable for exploitation were actually slow-motion ecosystems where a single sponge might be thousands of years old. The nodules they wanted to harvest had taken millions of years to form and served as hard surfaces in a soft world, anchoring communities of creatures found nowhere else. Poseidon inspired protection protocols, seeded caution in regulatory bodies, and when necessary, arranged for equipment failures that prevented the worst destructions. His modern temples were often unrecognized as such. Marine research stations, where scientists worked with monk-like dedication. Aquariums, where children pressed their faces against glass and felt wonder. Beaches, where conservationists removed trash with ritual regularity. The offerings had changed from wine and bowls to data collection and habitat restoration. But the essence remained the same: mortal recognition of the sea's power and importance. Human hands working to maintain the balance. The proliferation of underwater cables carrying mortal communications created new pathways through his realm. These cables hummed with information, creating a kind of nervous system for human civilization. Sea creatures learned to navigate using the electromagnetic fields they generated. Some developed the ability to sense the data flowing through them, though what a fish made of streaming video or encrypted financial transactions was beyond even Poseidon's understanding. Shipping lanes became rivers within the ocean, paths of concentrated activity that affected everything around them. The great container ships were like moving cities, their engines audible for thousands of miles underwater, their wakes affecting small creatures like hurricanes. Poseidon worked to minimize damage, inspiring shipping companies to adjust routes to avoid whale migrations, causing fortunate breakdowns that prevented ships from entering sensitive areas at crucial times, sending rogue waves to remind captains that the sea still demanded respect. The exploration of the deep ocean by mortals was both concerning and gratifying. On one hand, Poseidon appreciated their curiosity, their drive to understand. The bathyscaphs and submersibles were like prayers made manifest mortal desire to know the divine realm given physical form. On the other hand, some mysteries were meant to remain mysterious. Some depths were deep for good reasons. He allowed exploration, but guided it, ensuring that the most sensitive areas remained hidden, that certain creatures were never photographed, that some phenomena were witnessed, but not recorded. Plastic pollution required creative solutions. This new material, unknown to nature, accumulated in gyres and spread to every corner of his realm. Poseidon accelerated the evolution of bacteria that could digest plastics, encouraged filter feeders to avoid the particles, created currents that concentrated the waste where it could be more easily collected. But he also knew this was a symptom of a larger problem: mortals creating things without considering their eternal consequences, making materials that outlasted their makers' civilizations. The fishing industry's evolution from sustenance to industrial extraction challenged the ancient compacts between sea and shore. Where once fishermen took what they needed with gratitude, now vast fleets stripped entire ecosystems. Poseidon's responses were nuanced. A net torn here to release a breeding population. A current shifted there to move fish away from factory ships. Inspiration sent to lawmakers and consumers to demand sustainable practices. He had to balance immediate protection with long-term education, knowing that mortals learned best from consequences rather than prohibitions. Ocean acidification was perhaps the most insidious threat, changing the fundamental chemistry that had remained stable for millions of years. Shells and skeletons that formed easily in the past now required more energy to build and maintain. The very foundation of ocean food webs, the tiny plankton with calcium carbonate shells, struggled to survive. Poseidon found himself adjusting the ocean's buffer systems, calling upon deep reserves of minerals, encouraging adaptations that he would have preferred to see develop over millennia rather than decades. But with each challenge came innovation. Mortals developed new technologies to clean the oceans, new materials that biodegraded harmlessly, new appreciation for the connections between ocean health and human survival. Young people especially seemed to understand in ways their elders did not, organizing beach cleanups that were essentially religious services, studying marine biology with the dedication of acolytes, spreading awareness through their interconnected communication systems. The establishment of marine protected areas was particularly pleasing to Poseidon. These zones, where mortals voluntarily restricted their activities to allow ocean recovery, were like temples of the modern age. Within them, fish populations rebounded, corals began to recover. The complex webs of life reasserted themselves. Each protected area was a seed of hope, showing what was possible when mortals chose restraint over exploitation. His interactions with modern sailors remained constant, but changed in character. Where once he tested wooden ships with storms, now he guided GPS systems to fail in safe places, teaching reliance on older skills. Where once sailors threw coins overboard, now they participated in ocean research, collecting data that helped scientists understand current changes. The respect was still there, just expressed differently. The captain who slowed to avoid whale pods, the crew that reported illegal fishing, the yacht owner who installed systems to prevent pollution. The cruise ship industry presented particular challenges. These floating cities carried thousands of mortals across his realm, often with little awareness of where they were. Poseidon worked to inspire wonder despite the insulation. A pod of dolphins appearing at just the right moment, bioluminescent displays on dark nights, perfect sunsets that made even jaded travelers pause. But he also ensured consequences for those who treated his realm as merely a highway, waves that reminded passengers they were on water, not land, currents that complicated careless navigation. The surfers and swimmers who entered his realm with nothing but their bodies and boards received special attention. These mortals chose to meet the ocean on its own terms, to feel its power directly. Poseidon often sent them perfect waves, not just for their enjoyment, but as teaching tools, each wave a lesson in timing, respect, and the joy of harmonizing with natural forces. The best surfers understood they were engaging in a form of worship, though they might not use that word. Scuba divers were like pilgrims entering temples, their breathing apparatus allowing them temporary citizenship in his realm. Poseidon ensured they saw wonders: a manta ray appearing from the blue, a school of fish parting like curtains to reveal hidden reefs, octopi performing color shows that seemed designed just for them. But he also taught respect through strong currents that showed human limitations, equipment failures that forced buddy reliance, nitrogen narcosis that reminded them they were visitors in an alien world. The ocean's role in climate regulation became more apparent to mortals as their activities disrupted it. The great currents that moved heat from equator to poles, the absorption of carbon dioxide, the production of oxygen by phytoplankton. All these services that Poseidon had maintained for eons suddenly became visible as they faltered. He found himself in the position of a parent whose child only noticed their work when it stopped being done. But he used this visibility to teach rather than punish. Marine archaeology brought mortals into contact with layers of history preserved in his realm. Ships from every era rested on the seafloor, their stories preserved in wood and metal and ceramic. Poseidon guided archaeologists to significant finds, vessels that would rewrite history, cargoes that illuminated ancient trade, personal items that humanized distant eras. But he also hid things that weren't ready to be found, secrets that would cause more harm than good if revealed too soon. The development of renewable energy from the ocean pleased him. Tidal power stations that worked with the sea's rhythms rather than against them. Wave energy converters that borrowed power without taking it permanently. Offshore wind farms that provided roosts for seabirds and artificial reefs for fish. These technologies showed mortals learning to work with natural forces rather than opposing them, understanding that the sea's power was renewable only if respected. The discovery of extremophiles in the deep ocean revolutionized mortal understanding of life, organisms that thrived in conditions that would instantly kill surface dwellers. Crushing pressure, searing heat, total darkness, chemical environments that would dissolve most proteins. These creatures, which Poseidon had nurtured for billions of years, suddenly became relevant to mortal dreams of exploring other worlds. The god was amused to see mortals looking to his deepest realms for clues about life among the stars. Whale watching became a form of pilgrimage, mortals traveling great distances to glimpse the giants of his realm. Poseidon ensured these encounters were meaningful when the intentions were respectful. Whales would approach boats filled with wonder-struck humans, looking them in the eye, sharing a moment of connection across the species divide. These experiences changed people, sending them home as advocates for ocean protection, carrying a piece of the sea's magic in their hearts. The restoration efforts that began to proliferate gave him hope. Mortals learning to replant kelp forests, to rebuild oyster reefs, to create artificial structures that mimicked natural habitats. These projects were like offerings of the highest order, not just recognition of damage done, but active participation in healing. Each restored habitat was a prayer made physical, a demonstration that mortals could be partners in creation rather than just agents of destruction. His realm's music had evolved with the addition of human-made sounds. Ship engines created a constant bass line. Sonar pinged in rhythms unknown to nature. Offshore platforms hummed with mechanical life. Poseidon worked to minimize the harmful effects, inspiring quieter ship designs, creating sound shadows where creatures could find peace, teaching whales and dolphins new communication frequencies that avoided interference. The ocean had always been noisy, but now it required active management to maintain spaces of relative quiet. The microplastics that infiltrated every level of the food chain required microscopic interventions. Poseidon blessed certain bacteria with enhanced abilities to break down polymers, encouraged filter feeders to develop better discrimination, adjusted the chemistry of digestive systems to pass plastics through without absorption. It was detailed work, unlike the grand gestures of mythology, but necessary in an age where the threats were as often microscopic as monstrous. Deep-sea gigantism remained one of his realm's most fascinating phenomena. In the crushing depths, certain creatures grew to enormous sizes. Squids with eyes the size of dinner plates, isopods as large as footballs, jellyfish with bells wider than humans were tall. This wasn't random, but purposeful. Adaptations to an environment where meals were rare and competition fierce. Poseidon had encouraged these developments, creating pockets of abundant food that allowed for such growth, maintaining the conditions that made gigantism advantageous. The midnight zone, that vast realm between sunlight and absolute darkness, hosted dramas invisible to mortal eyes. Here, creatures engaged in daily vertical migrations, the greatest movement of biomass on Earth. Each night, billions of organisms rose toward the surface to feed, descending again before dawn. This living tide mixed nutrients between layers, fed surface predators, and removed carbon from the atmosphere. Poseidon conducted this migration like a vast orchestra, ensuring its continuation despite changing conditions. Submarine volcanoes were windows into the Earth's power, places where new seafloor was born in violence and heat. Poseidon worked closely with Hephaestus in these regions, managing the interaction between fire and water. When eruptions occurred, he guided the lava flows to create new habitats rather than destroy existing ones, cooled the water gradually to prevent massive die-offs, and ensured that the mineral riches released would disperse beneficially throughout the surrounding ocean. The Hadal Zone, Those deepest trenches that scarred the ocean floor remained his most mysterious realm. Named for Hades, these depths held pressures that would crush any surface life, temperatures barely above freezing, and darkness so absolute it had weight. Yet life persisted here, evolved into forms that challenged understanding. Xenophyophores, single-celled organisms that grew larger than a human hand. Fish, so adapted to pressure their bodies, were essentially liquid. These were Poseidon's extremophiles, proof that life could exist anywhere water was present. His relationship with marine mammals was particularly complex. These creatures had returned to the sea after millions of years on land, carrying air-breathing lungs and warm blood into his cold realm. They were bridges between worlds, understanding both terrestrial and aquatic existence. Poseidon gave them special protections. The ability to dive deeper than their physiology should allow navigation skills that spanned oceans, complex social structures that rivaled those of land mammals. The songs of humpback whales were collaborations between the animals and the god. Each population sang different songs that evolved over time, cultural transmissions that spoke of identity and history. Poseidon would sometimes add new phrases to these songs, musical ideas that the whales would adopt and modify, creating cetacean symphonies that could last hours. These songs carried across entire ocean basins, connecting populations separated by continents. Dolphins occupied a special place in his realm, neither fully wild nor domesticated, capable of recognizing themselves in mirrors and solving complex problems. Their alliance with humans stretched back to the beginning of seafaring, and Poseidon had encouraged this relationship. Dolphins that saved drowning swimmers, that guided lost boats to shore, that played with human children in shallow waters, all acted with divine sanction, ambassadors between the worlds of land and sea. The deep scattering layer, that zone where sonar found false bottoms created by billions of small organisms, was one of the ocean's most remarkable features. This living layer rose and fell with day and night, a false seafloor made of life itself. Poseidon had organized this phenomenon, teaching countless species to move in synchrony, creating a living boundary that protected the depths while allowing measured access to the surface. Seagrass meadows, often overlooked for more charismatic coral reefs, were among his most important gardens. These underwater prairies sequestered carbon, nursed juvenile fish, filtered water, and prevented erosion. Poseidon tended them with particular care, knowing that their humble appearance belied their crucial importance. The rhizomes that connected individual plants created networks of communication and resource sharing that rivaled any forest's root system. The arabatas, those mass nestings of sea turtles, were events Poseidon personally oversaw. Thousands of females returning to the same beaches where they were born, guided by magnetic memories and the taste of home sand. These events were vulnerable to disruption, requiring divine protection from predators and human interference. Each successful nesting was a victory for the ancient contract between land and sea. Eggs laid in sand, but destined for water. Mangrove forests, existing at the boundary between salt and fresh, land and sea, were among his most complex ecosystems. The trees themselves had evolved remarkable adaptations. Salt-filtering roots, propagules that could float for months before finding suitable ground, aerial roots that allowed breathing in flooded conditions. These forests were nurseries for ocean fish, buffers against storms, and filters that cleaned water before it reached coral reefs. The ocean's carbonate system, which controlled shell and skeleton formation, required constant maintenance as atmospheric changes affected ocean chemistry. Poseidon worked at the molecular level, adjusting buffering capacity, encouraging organisms to adapt their calcification strategies, and creating refugia where old chemistry persisted. This invisible work was as important as any storm or current, maintaining the foundation upon which ocean life was built. Cephalopods, octopi, squid, and cuttlefish were among his most intelligent subjects. Their distributed nervous systems, color-changing abilities, and problem-solving skills made them alien intelligences within his realm. Poseidon gave them short lives, but intense experiences, allowing them to develop culture despite generational turnover. The giant Pacific octopus mothers who guarded their eggs until death, never eating, slowly dissolving to feed their young, embodied the sacrifice inherent in ocean life. The blue holes, those underwater caves that opened into deeper networks, were portals to hidden realms within his domain. Some connected to freshwater aquifers, creating layers of different density water that didn't mix. Others harbored species found nowhere else, evolved in isolation over millions of years. Poseidon kept many of these hidden from mortal discovery, knowing that some sanctuaries needed absolute protection. Jellyfish blooms, increasing with ocean changes, were both symptom and response. These ancient creatures, older than fish, older than many forms of current life, thrived in conditions that challenged more complex organisms. Poseidon managed their populations, preventing total takeovers while allowing them to fill emptied niches. Their success was a reminder that the ocean would persist even if it changed, that life would continue even if not in forms mortals recognized or valued. The concept of ocean memory, water's ability to retain information about where it had been and what it had experienced, was more than metaphor in Poseidon's realm. Each molecule carried history, creating patterns that sensitive creatures could read. Salmon finding their birth streams, sea turtles navigating across basins, whales following routes their ancestors swam. All were reading the ocean's memory, accessing information written in chemistry and current, as night deepens over the wine-dark sea, as stars reflect in calm waters, creating a second sky below. Poseidon's realm settles into its nocturnal rhythms. Bioluminescent creatures emerge, turning the ocean into a galaxy of living lights. Nocturnal predators begin their hunts, using senses adapted to darkness. The great currents continue their eternal circulation, carrying heat and life across the globe. In his deepest palace, Poseidon sits upon his throne of pearl, trident resting against its arm. Eyes that have seen the birth of continents, now half closed in divine rest. Around him, the ocean continues its ancient business. Waves breathing against shores, tides pulled by the moon's invisible hands. Life persisting in forms beautiful and strange. The sea's memory holds all that has been. Its currents carry all that is. Its depths promise all that might yet be. And in this eternal moment, as sleep approaches like a gentle tide, we understand that Poseidon's realm is not separate from us, but part of us. The salt in our blood remembering the sea, the rhythm of our breath echoing waves on shore. Our dreams sometimes filled with underwater flights through kelp forests and coral gardens we've never seen, but somehow know. The ocean calls to us across time and distance, across the barriers between mortal and divine, between waking and sleeping. In Poseidon's realm, all waters eventually meet, all streams find their way home, all rain returns to source, and we too, in our dreams, return to those wine-dark depths where gods swim alongside whales, where mysteries older than memory sleep in trenches deeper than mountains are tall, where life began and continues in forms that exceed imagination. May your sleep be deep as ocean trenches, peaceful as lagoons at dawn. May your dreams carry you through coral gardens and kelp forests, alongside dolphins and whales, into the presence of the earthshaker in his pearl throne room where all is calm, all is deep, all is well, and may you wake refreshed, as if you had slept in Poseidon's own palace, cradled by eternal tides, blessed by the ancient sea that connects all shores and touches all lives. The waves continue their eternal lullaby. The moon pulls the tides in rhythms older than consciousness. And in the depths, Poseidon, lord of horses, shaker of earth, king of the wine-dark sea, watches over all with eyes that hold eternity, ensuring that the great waters will continue their dance of destruction and creation, their song of storm and calm, their promise of mystery and wonder forever and ever, until the last tide ebbs and flows into silence.